Small landlords in New York City feel neglected and forgotten after the city implemented tenant protections that hurt their bottom line and made it impossible to run their businesses. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article today, and it's really going over the fate of small landlords, specifically in New York City. But this can really be said about small landlords throughout the entire country. So the problem is that a lot of new laws, new rules, and new regulations are being passed, specifically in New York City. But like I said, all over the country. And these laws, they really hurt small landlords because we don't have the means to fight these laws. We don't always even know that the laws exist. We don't have the teams of lawyers and accountants and the money necessary to really make it so that we can operate our businesses in the best way possible. So New York, they implemented back in 2019 new laws in terms of their rent regulation, their rent control, and it really punished these small landlords. And nobody feels sorry for them because in the minds of the majority of people, landlords are these super rich people who got plenty of money and they're just trying to screw tenants over. And that's just not the case, okay? The majority of small landlords are just normal people. They just, they work a job, they happen to own property on the side of it, and they rent that property out to tenants. Some of them make money, some of them don't make money. And it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be that a person who owns this property has to lose money because they have to follow all these rules and regulations that are almost impossible to follow. Okay, so when they passed this new law, it punished small landlords. Then on top of that, we all know what happened in 2020. The eviction moratorium, all of the tenant protections put in place due to the pandemic, and it was like a double hit, okay? It was a double hit, and you put landlords out of business. You destroyed their finances, and it's very, very difficult to see. So the article I'm reading today is actually, they talked to some landlords, even though it's written more from a anti-landlord perspective, they do have some good nuggets in there of information about the fate of small landlords. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like, subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think, okay? Do you believe that small landlords in New York City they're just whining and complaining, or do you think that they actually are struggling through all of the ridiculous laws that they've put in place? As I've mentioned before, when they pass a law hoping to target this, the mega landlords with thousands of units, well, it goes all the way down to the people who own maybe one single family home or, a duplex where they live in one side and they rent out the other. It goes all the way down to that person. They have to jump through the same hoops as, these billion-dollar companies. And, that's just not right, okay? I've never agreed with that. That's why I don't like to see these laws implemented, even if the target is, these big companies. I don't want to see those big companies have to face those laws because it will eventually filter down to the small landlords as well. So let's get into this article. This article is coming from curbed.com, and it says, landlords and tenants, if you can't exclude someone, do you even own it? I'm not exactly sure what that title means, but it seems pretty obvious that the author of this article is not on our side. But, let's get into it. I'll critique it as I go through it. No one at the landlords' rights protest wanted to give me their full name. One woman said she was concerned about harassment. Another claimed she couldn't go on the record because of her job. The sole exception that October morning was Brian Liff, a clean-cut 50-year-old software engineer wearing standard-issue city business guy attire. The state fundamentally took my property, he said as cars hurtled past us outside Kathy Hochul's Manhattan office. Liv had bought an 8-unit rent-stabilized building in Harlem just a few months before New York passed the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019, a sweeping set of reforms that significantly limited the power landlords have to raise rents and evict rent-regulated tenants. Then came the pandemic, followed by state and federal eviction moratoriums like inconvenient little dominoes. Liv had planned to evict the tenants in 4 of the building's occupied units and build himself a well-appointed family home. But that was now off the table. In his estimation, The past couple of years had amounted to the state telling him, "You must house people against your will." Dream home deferred. He can't even rid himself of the place since he says he can't sell the building for anything close to what he put into it. He feels boxed in by the state. Yeah, and that's an interesting story right there. So we have a landlord who purchased a multifamily property with the intention of turning it into his personal residence, right? But because of this new 2019 law that was passed in New York, he is unable to remove those tenants. I'm not exactly sure of the wording of the law, but what it sounds like is that it has a a no fault eviction thing where you can't evict somebody from the property with the intention of moving in. You have to have just cause. Okay, so so basically he's stuck with the property, and my suggestion would be to sell it at the loss, take the loss, and get out. But he's holding on to it, probably hoping that eventually he'll get the appreciation so that he doesn't have to pull money out of his own pocket when he sells. The 150 or so protesters standing with him were largely in agreement on that point. They held posters reading "Small Landlord Lives Matter" and "Give Landlords Due Process Now." The consensus among the crowd was that the bias against landlords had reached a fever pitch and was coming from all directions: the governor, the state legislator, the courts, and the general public. In the nearly 3 years since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, millions of tenants have engaged in rent strikes, whether declared or de facto, while membership in tenant unions and building associations ballooned. Somewhere in all this tension between renters and owners, more landlords began to publicly embrace the language of a protected class being ignored, or worse, by its elected officials. The battle lines were reflected in the press. In the New York Daily News, a realtor wrote that landlords are people too, and claimed a kind of financial symmetry between struggling tenants and their struggling landlords who are barely able to meet their own families' needs for food, housing, and utilities. So when I read this, I was like, well, they're acting like this isn't true, okay? All this is true. These landlords are struggling just like the tenants are, okay? And you cannot own a property, not get paid any rent, and then still make your mortgage payment. It just does not work that way. Okay, so when you have all these anti-landlord stuff going up like eviction protections or tenants going on strike and deciding not to pay for whatever reason or demanding that you can't raise rents to meet your increased expenses, well, you know what? That hurts the people who own the building. Now, the problem is that when they think of landlords, right, all they can see is, oh, well, all landlords are super rich. No, they're not. Okay, not even in New York are all the landlords super rich. A lot of landlords are renting out spare rooms in their houses, or like I said before, they have a duplex or a quadplex and they're renting out the other units and living in one of the units themselves. So when they have imagine you had a fourplex unit, your other three tenants decide they're not paying rent, and all of a sudden you can't make the mortgage payment anymore. Okay, it's not right. It shouldn't be done that way. And the landlord themselves might be a middle-class person. They even mentioned that, hey, these people, they work jobs, okay? If they're so rich, why are they working a regular job? Because they are normal people. Now, yeah, I will admit the majority of the units in a place like New York are going to be owned by these huge mega corporations that own huge buildings, right? But that doesn't mean that all landlords are those type of people who own, hundreds or thousands of units, okay? The majority of landlords, and the reason I say this, right, the majority of landlords, when you own one unit and there's 100,000 of you, well, there's 100,000 separate landlords, okay? 100,000 people with their own leases, their own properties, their own, so there's going to be way more landlords who own a small number of units than there are landlords who own a huge number of units. So, yeah, I mean, if any landlord who is a small mom and pop landlord ends up suffering because of rules put in place to attack the big guys, well, I mean, I have a problem with that. An estimated 28% of New York City's 2.3 million rental units are held by landlords who own fewer than 5 properties, which is what passes for a mom and pop shop in a city of mega developers and private equity ownership. As of 2019, only 13% of units were rented out by a landlord with just one home in their portfolio. And I'm going to stop right there. They said 13% of the 2.3 million, 13% of 2.3 million units are owned by owner with only one property, right? Well, that's still a huge, huge number. So, if you did 10%, that would be 230,000, separate small landlords who only own one property. Okay? So, I mean, just imagine hundreds of thousands of people who are small landlords who are getting treated as though they are garbage because they are renting out their one property. And, they can't evict people. They're not being paid their rent by their tenants. And, they're getting abused by a system where they have to follow the same rules as these, mega landlords. Oh, man. Even so, this fraction of the industry has become the face of an emerging political identity among property owners, the underdog landlord, a struggling, small-scale operator hobbled by the political status quo. They're drowning in debt, in danger of losing their homes over missed payments or rent caps, and facing routine abuse from tenants and the scorn of the greater public. And that morning, the assembled landlords were ready to fight back. Yeah, and that's actually a pretty accurate description, They are drowning, and all the things they said. I mean, it's accurate, maybe not for, throughout the entire country, but in these places with these laws like rent control, that is pretty accurate, So I kind of disagree on the idea that a person who owns fewer than 5 properties is considered a small landlord. They mentioned that. But if that's what they're going by, then still more than 1 out of every 4 landlords, meets the definition. So yeah, I mean, it totally, to me, it kind of depends on the number of units a person owns rather than the number of properties. Because you can own, 5 properties, under 5 properties. You can own 4 properties, each one of them being a 500 unit apartment complex, and then you're essentially still a very large landlord. Or you can own 4 properties and each one of them being a single family home, and you can be a small landlord. You see, I don't really like that definition they used right there. So yeah, I mean, the anti-landlord bias in this article is pretty obvious. I'm sure that the big issue they have is that these mega landlords they think that they're using small landlords in order to garner sympathy. Well, yeah, they are, right? And can you blame them? I mean, really, the small landlords have to play by the same rules as the big ones. So, why don't they allow the small ones to come out and say what their problem is? And, maybe we can get this resolved. Right now, there are an estimated 569,000 tenants in New York State who owe a cumulative $2.4 billion in back rent. Debts that increased during the pandemic and compounded as rents in the city soared over the past year. Landlord groups say these deficits, along with inflation, share the cost of utilities and rising taxes, have scrambled their budget sheets. According to a report released earlier this year by the Rent Guidelines Board, the 9-member body that sets rent adjustments on the city's stabilized housing stock, landlords' net operating income plummeted almost 8% over the past year. And according to an analysis of JP Morgan's internal data, small and medium-sized landlords in New York lost more rental income than landlords nearly anywhere else in the country during 2020, as residents lost jobs or simply fled. Yeah, I covered an article a while back, and it was actually covering that fact right there. And it also covered the fact that the small mom and pop landlords were more likely than the larger landlords to not be paid rent during the pandemic. They were more likely to have to go through eviction. They had lower rents overall than the big landlords, right? So they had smaller cash reserves. I mean, it's like a perfect combination of trouble when you're one of these smaller landlords in a lot of cases. And it's understandable when you're talking about a person who is not a professional. They're operating as a kind of a side hustle, right, as a landlord. So they don't have the same amount of emergency reserves as a large business would. They don't have the professionalism. They don't have a legal team, an accounting team, etc., property management team. They're doing a lot of the stuff on their own. And it means that, hey, their businesses, they don't operate as efficiently. So they get taken advantage of by tenants who know the game, and you see what the result is, right? You end up with a lot of landlords who, during the pandemic, ended up really struggling, and that's why I'm covering this article. It's a long article, right? So I suggest you read the link in the description and read the entire article yourself, but that's all I'm going to be covering from it today.